The Montana sky stretched endless and unforgiving above the Copper Creek Ranch. As dawn broke over the rugged landscape of 1885, dust motes danced in the golden light filtering through the bunkhouse windows, where 23-year-old Kit Brennan pulled on her worn leather boots with practiced silence. Her calloused hands, roughened by months of hard labor, wrapped strips of cloth around her chest with the efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kit had been living as Charlie Brennan for 8 months now, one of 15 ranch hands working the sprawling cattle operation, owned by Marcus Whitfield. Every morning began the same way, binding her chest, pulling on her deceased brother's clothes that hung loose on her slender frame, and tucking her auburn hair beneath a battered hat that had seen better days. The deception that had started as desperate necessity had become second nature, though the constant vigilance required to maintain her disguise left her perpetually exhausted. The bunkhouse stirred to life around her as other cowboys began their morning routines. She'd learned to navigate their crude conversations, their casual violence, and their assumptions about what made a man worthy of respect. Kit had discovered that keeping her voice low, her responses brief, and her work ethic beyond reproach allowed her to blend into the background of ranch life. She was known as the quiet one, the hard worker who never complained and never caused trouble. "Morning, Charlie," mumbled Pete Donovan, a grizzled veteran cowboy who'd taken Kit under his wing during her first weeks on the ranch. Pete was pushing 60, with silver-streaked hair and hands that bore the scars of decades spent working with cattle and horses. He'd been the first to show her the ropes, teaching her how to read the mood of the herd, how to anticipate trouble before it started, and how to earn the respect of men who judged worth by strength and skill alone. "Morning, Pete," Kit replied, her voice carefully pitched to the lower register she'd practiced until it became natural. She'd learned that responding with too much enthusiasm marked her as inexperienced, while being too taciturn made her seem unfriendly. The balance required constant attention, another layer of performance in a life that had become entirely about performing. The ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, bordered by the Yellowstone River to the south and the Beartooth Mountains to the north. Marcus Whitfield had built his empire through shrewd business dealings and an iron will that brook no nonsense from employees, competitors, or the harsh landscape itself. The Copper Creek Ranch ran nearly 3,000 head of cattle, making it one of the largest operations in the territory. Kit had come to Montana, fleeing a tragedy that still haunted her dreams. Back in Ohio, she'd lived with her brother Daniel on their family's small farm after their parents died of consumption. Daniel had been her protector, her best friend, and her only remaining family. When he'd been killed in a farming accident, crushed beneath an overturned wagon while trying to save their neighbor's child, Kit had been left alone with debts she couldn't pay and neighbors who expected her to marry quickly or face destitution. The idea of disguising herself as a man had come from desperation rather than inspiration. Daniel's clothes still hung in his wardrobe. His identity still existed in letters and documents. With careful alterations and practiced mannerisms, Catherine Brennan could disappear entirely, replaced by her deceased brother Charlie seeking work in the territories. The plan had seemed impossible until she'd actually attempted it, discovering that most men saw what they expected to see and asked few questions about a young cowboy's past. The work on Copper Creek Ranch was backbreaking and dangerous. Kit spent her days herding cattle across vast ranges, repairing fences that stretched for miles, and handling horses that could kill an inexperienced rider without warning. She'd learned to rope with deadly accuracy, to read weather patterns that could turn lethal in minutes, and to navigate the complex social dynamics of men who settled disputes with fists or guns. Her slight build, which she'd worried would give Her away immediately actually worked in her favor among cowboys who valued endurance over pure strength. Kit could outlast most of the other hands during long days in the saddle, and her quick reflexes had saved her from serious injury more than once. She'd developed a reputation as reliable and steady, exactly the kind of cowboy that ranch foremen valued most. The other hands had gradually accepted her as one of their own, though she remained careful never to get too close to anyone. Friendship required sharing personal stories, and Kit's fabricated past wouldn't withstand close scrutiny. She'd created a carefully constructed background about growing up on a small farm in Nebraska, losing her parents to disease and drifting west like so many other young men seeking opportunity on the frontier. Marcus Whitfield himself was a formidable presence on the ranch, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd built his fortune through cattle ranching but had diversified into mining, railroad investments, and territorial politics. Whitfield demanded excellence from his employees and paid well for it, but he had no patience for weakness or excuses. Had encountered the ranch owner only a handful of times during her months at Copper Creek, but each interaction had left her feeling as though he was evaluating her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to making quick judgments about people's worth. She'd been careful to demonstrate competence without drawing undue attention, walking the fine line between being noticed for good work and being scrutinized too closely. The ranch employed not just cowboys, but also a blacksmith, a cook, several horse trainers, and seasonal workers who came and went with the demands of cattle drives and roundups. The hierarchy was clear and strictly observed. Ranch foreman Jake Sullivan answered directly to Whitfield. The senior cowboys like Pete Donovan commanded respect from younger hands, and everyone understood their place in the carefully structured world of ranch life. Jake Sullivan was a man Kit had learned to avoid whenever possible. The foreman was in his early 40s, with dark hair and a volatile temper that could explode without warning. He ruled the cowboys through intimidation and favoritism, rewarding those who flattered him while making life miserable for anyone who crossed him. Sullivan had a particular dislike for what he called pretty boys, young cowboys who he suspected of being too soft for ranch work. Kit had managed to stay beneath Sullivan's radar by working harder than anyone else and never giving him reason to single her out for criticism. She'd watched him humiliate other cowboys for minor infractions, using his authority to settle personal grudges and maintain his position through fear. The experience had taught her that survival on the ranch required not just physical toughness but political awareness of the unspoken alliances and rivalries that shaped daily life. The bunkhouse where Kit slept housed 8 cowboys in cramped quarters that offered little privacy. She'd learned to change clothes quickly and quietly, to position her bedroll in a corner where she was less likely to be observed, and to time her trips to the outhouse when she was least likely to encounter other hands. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but the alternative discovery and the consequences that would follow kept her motivated to maintain her deception. Ranch work followed the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of the cattle. Spring brought calving season, when Kit and the other hands worked around the clock to assist with difficult births and protect newborns from predators. Summer meant long days moving herds to fresh, grazing lands and maintaining the ranch's extensive fencing and water systems. Fall brought the massive undertaking of roundup, when every head of cattle had to be counted, branded, and prepared for sale or winter feeding. The pay was good by frontier standards, $30 a month plus room and board, but Kit was saving every penny she could manage. Her long-term plan remained vague, shaped more by the desire to avoid her past than by clear goals for her future. She'd learned that survival on the frontier required adaptability, and she'd become skilled at taking each day as it came without dwelling too much on what might happen tomorrow. On this particular morning in late October, Kit sensed something different in the atmosphere of the ranch. There was tension in the air that had nothing to do with weather or cattle prices. Pete Donovan seemed unusually quiet as he prepared his gear, and the other cowboys moved with the careful deliberation of men who suspected trouble but couldn't identify its source. The feeling intensified as Kit made her way to the mess hall for breakfast. Conversation stopped abruptly when she entered, and several of the hands avoided making eye contact. The cook, a surly German immigrant named Klaus Weber, served up beans and bacon with his usual efficiency, but even he seemed more subdued than normal. "Heard there's a new man starting today," Pete mentioned quietly as Kit settled beside him with her plate. "Whitfield hired him directly, which isn't usual. Sullivan's madder than a wet cat about not being consulted." Kit nodded, understanding the implications. Marcus Whitfield typically left hiring decisions to his foreman, trusting Jake Sullivan to evaluate potential employees and maintain the ranch's workforce. For the owner to bypass his foreman suggested either dissatisfaction with Sullivan's judgment or special circumstances surrounding the new hire. "Know anything about him?" Kit asked, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention from the other hands. Pete shook his head. "Just that he's young, experienced, and comes with references from some big operation down in Texas. Name's supposed to be Luke Morrison or something like that. Sullivan's been grumbling about outsiders and questioning why we need another hand when winter's coming." The news troubled Kit more than she wanted to admit. New arrivals meant increased scrutiny as everyone sized up the addition to their group. A newcomer would be curious about his fellow cowboys, asking questions and observing behaviors that the established hands had long since stopped noticing. Kit had managed to blend into the background of ranch life, precisely because she'd been there long enough to become part of the familiar landscape. As the cowboys finished breakfast and prepared for the day's work, Jake Sullivan appeared in the doorway of the mess hall. His presence immediately changed the mood in the room as conversations died and men focused their attention on their plates. Sullivan's authority was absolute within the confines of ranch operations, and his displeasure could make life miserable for anyone who crossed him. "Listen up," Sullivan announced, his voice carrying the edge that warned of dangerous currents. "Beneath the surface, we got a new man starting today. He'll be working with the horse training operation initially, but Whitfield wants him integrated with the regular crew. I expect everyone to show proper courtesy while maintaining our standards." The carefully chosen words conveyed multiple messages to anyone familiar with Sullivan's management style. Proper courtesy meant avoiding open hostility that might reflect poorly on the ranch, while maintaining our standards suggested that the newcomer would need to prove himself according to the established hierarchy. Sullivan was making it clear that despite Whitfield's direct involvement in the hiring, the foreman intended to maintain control over how the new cowboy was received. Kit felt her stomach tighten as she considered the implications. A newcomer, focused on horse training, would be working closely with the animals she'd come to love during her months on the ranch. Horses had always been her passion, even back in Ohio, and her skill with them had contributed significantly to her acceptance among the other cowboys. A new arrival in that area would inevitably observe her work closely and might notice details that others had overlooked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning's work assignments sent Kit and several other hands to the northern pastures, where a section of fencing had been damaged by recent storms. The ride took them through some of the most beautiful country Kit had ever seen, rolling hills covered in autumn grass, stands of aspen trees turning gold and red, and the ever-present backdrop of snow-capped mountains that reminded her of how far she'd traveled from her former life. Working alongside Pete Donovan and two younger cowboys, Kit fell into the familiar rhythm of fence repair. The work required strength, skill, and endurance as they dug new post holes, stretched wire, and secured supports that would need to withstand Montana's harsh weather. Kit had learned to pace herself during such tasks, using technique and leverage. to compensate for her smaller stature while maintaining the steady productivity that had earned her respect among the hands. As they worked, Pete shared stories about his early days on the ranch and the changes he'd witnessed over the years. The old cowboy had become something of a mentor to Kit, offering advice about everything from handling difficult horses to navigating the politics of ranch life. His acceptance had been crucial to her successful integration into the crew, and she valued his friendship even as she remained careful not to reveal too much about her own background. "Times are changing out here," Pete mused as they stretched a particularly stubborn section of wire. "Used to be a man could make his living with cattle and horses, no questions asked. Now there's talk of homesteaders, railroad expansion, mining operations. Whitfield's been meeting with all kinds of businessmen, planning for what comes next." The observation reminded Kit that her current situation, however stable it might seem, was built on foundations that could shift without warning. The frontier was changing rapidly, and opportunities that existed today might disappear tomorrow. Her disguise had allowed her to earn a living and build some financial security, but she'd always known it was a temporary solution to permanent problems. Sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation as 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Even at a distance, Kit could identify Marcus Whitfield's distinctive figure and his preferred mount, a black stallion that he'd trained himself. The other 2 riders were unfamiliar, though one carried himself with the confident bearing of an experienced horseman. As the group drew closer, Kit found herself studying the stranger who was undoubtedly the new hire Pete had mentioned earlier. The man appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark hair and the lean build typical of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. There was something about his posture and the way he handled his horse that suggested extensive experience with cattle operations, confirming the reports of his Texas background. What caught Kit's attention most, however, was the way the newcomer's eyes moved across the landscape and the people working on it. This wasn't the casual observation of someone getting oriented to new surroundings. It was the systematic assessment of someone trained to notice details and evaluate situations quickly. Kit felt an instinctive wariness that she couldn't quite explain, a sense that this man might pose dangers she hadn't yet identified. The 3 riders approached the fence line, where Kit and her companions were working. Marcus Whitfield nodded acknowledgement to the crew while maintaining the formal distance he typically kept from individual cowboys. The ranch owner's presence always created a subtle tension among the hands, who understood that their performance was being evaluated, even during routine tasks. "Pete," Whitfield called out, "I want you to meet Luke Morrison. He'll be working with our horse training operation, but I'd like him to understand all aspects of ranch operations. Can you show him how we handle fence maintenance?" Pete touched his hat respectfully. "Yes, sir, Mr. Whitfield. Be glad to show him the ropes." Kit continued working, hoping to avoid notice, but found herself hyper-aware of the new arrival's presence. Something about Luke Morrison seemed familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. Perhaps it was simply the confidence he projected, or the way he asked intelligent questions about the fencing techniques Pete demonstrated. Whatever the source, Kit felt increasingly uncomfortable under what seemed like unusually intense scrutiny. As the demonstration continued, Morrison's attention seemed to focus more and more on Kit herself. She caught him observing her work methods, her interactions with the other cowboys, and her handling of tools and materials. The attention wasn't obviously hostile, but it was persistent in a way that made her skin crawl with apprehension. When Whitfield and the 3rd rider departed, leaving Morrison to continue learning from Pete, Kit found herself trapped in a situation she couldn't easily escape. The new cowboy's questions became more personal, touching on backgrounds and experiences that required careful answers to maintain her fabricated identity. "You handle that wire like someone who's done plenty of fence work," Morrison observed, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Learned that growing up on a farm?" "Some," Kit replied, keeping her response brief while continuing to work. Picked up most of it here on the ranch. Nebraska, wasn't it? Tough country for farming. What part? The question seemed innocent enough. But Kit detected something beneath the surface that set off alarm bells in her mind. Morrison was asking follow-up questions in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than casual conversation. She provided vague responses about the southeastern part of the state, hoping to satisfy his curiosity without offering details that could be verified or contradicted. As the afternoon wore on, Kit became increasingly certain that Luke Morrison represented a threat she didn't yet understand. His presence changed the comfortable dynamic she'd established with Pete and the other cowboys, introducing an element of unpredictability that made her carefully constructed world feel suddenly fragile. The realization that her disguise, which had protected her for 8 months, might be vulnerable to discovery by this newcomer filled Kit with a familiar dread she hadn't felt since her first terrifying weeks on the ranch. Everything she'd built, every relationship she'd formed, every bit of security she'd managed to create could be destroyed if Luke Morrison suspected her true identity. As the sun began to set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Kit faced the possibility that her carefully ordered world was about to change in ways she couldn't control or predict. The comfortable anonymity of Charlie Brennan might be coming to an end, forcing her to confront questions about who she really was and what she was willing to risk to protect the life she'd built through deception. The evening shadows grew longer as the fence crew prepared to return to the ranch house, but Kit couldn't shake the feeling that this day marked the beginning of something that would test every skill she'd developed and every lesson she'd learned about survival on the frontier. Luke Morrison's arrival felt less like a routine addition to the ranch workforce and more like the first note of a storm that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her place in this harsh but beautiful world. The first week of Luke Morrison's presence on Copper Creek Ranch passed like walking on thin ice, every step careful, every movement calculated to avoid the crack that would send everything plunging into dark water below. Kit found herself constantly aware of where Morrison was, what he was doing, and whether his attention was focused in her direction. Sleep became elusive as her mind raced through possible explanations for his persistent interest and potential. Responses to whatever suspicions he might be forming. Morrison had been assigned to work, primarily with the ranch's horse training operation. But Marcus Whitfield's instructions to familiarize him with all aspects of ranch life meant he rotated through different crews and responsibilities. Kit's luck ran out on Tuesday morning when Jake Sullivan announced work assignments and paired her with Morrison for the day's tasks. "Charlie, you'll be working with Luke today," Sullivan declared with the kind of smile that suggested he found the arrangement amusing for reasons Kit couldn't fathom. "He needs to understand our cattle handling procedures, and you're one of our most reliable hands. Show him how we do things here at Copper Creek." The assignment felt like a trap, though Kit couldn't determine whether Sullivan was acting on suspicion, following Whitfield's orders, or simply making a random pairing that happened to be her worst nightmare. Morrison's expression revealed nothing as he nodded acknowledgement of the assignment, but Kit caught something in his eyes that suggested satisfaction rather than mere acceptance. Their destination was the eastern pasture where a group of steers had been separated from the main herd for medical treatment. The work would require close cooperation as they examined each animal, administered medications, and documented their findings for the ranch's records. It was exactly the kind of task that would force extended conversation and detailed observation of each other's techniques and mannerisms. The ride to the pasture took them through terrain that showcased the ranch's natural beauty: rolling hills, covered in prairie grass that had turned golden with the approach of winter, scattered groves of cottonwood trees along seasonal streams, and always the magnificent backdrop of the Burrtooth Mountains rising like ancient sentinels against the sky. Under different circumstances, Kit would have enjoyed the journey and the opportunity to work with the animals she'd grown to love during her months on the ranch. Morrison proved to be an excellent horseman, managing his mount with the kind of unconscious skill that spoke of years spent in the saddle. His horse, a bay gelding he'd brought with him from Texas, responded to subtle commands that demonstrated the kind of partnership that developed between experienced riders and their preferred animals. Kit found herself grudgingly impressed by his competence, even as she worried about what that competence might reveal about her own background and abilities. "Nice morning for this kind of work," Morrison commented as they approached the holding pen where the steers were confined. His voice carried the easy conversational tone of someone making small talk. But Kit had learned to distrust casual remarks from a man who seemed to say nothing without purpose. "Weather's been cooperative," Kit agreed, dismounting and beginning to prepare the medical supplies they'd need for the day's work. She discovered that focusing on tasks helped her maintain the character she'd created while providing legitimate reasons to avoid extended eye contact or conversation. Morrison dismounted with fluid grace and immediately began studying the steers they'd be working with during the day. His assessment was thorough and professional, noting animals that appeared to be recovering well from their treatments, alongside others that might require additional attention. Kit watched him work and recognized the expertise of someone who'd dealt with similar situations many times before. "That black steer with the white face, see how he's favoring his left front leg?" Morrison pointed toward an animal near the back of the group, probably an abscess that needs drainage. "You notice things like that after you've seen enough of them." The observation was accurate and demonstrated the kind of diagnostic skill that came from extensive experience with cattle medicine. Kit had noticed the same animal but hadn't immediately identified the specific problem Morrison had recognized so quickly. She found herself wondering about his background and training, questions that seemed dangerous to pursue given her own need to avoid scrutiny. Working together over the next several hours, Kit discovered that Morrison was not only knowledgeable, but also methodical and careful in his approach to animal care. He treated each steer with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested genuine concern for their welfare, rather than just completion of assigned tasks. His techniques were different from what she'd learned at Copper Creek, but equally effective, reflecting training from operations that might have faced different challenges or adopted different approaches. The conversation that developed between them as they worked felt natural and professional, covering topics related to cattle care, ranch management, and the particular challenges of working in Montana's climate. Morrison asked intelligent questions about Copper Creek's methods and offered insights from his own experience without being condescending or overly critical. Kit found herself relaxing slightly as she realized he seemed genuinely interested in learning rather than testing her knowledge or looking for inconsistencies in her responses. By midday, they'd treated most of the steers and were taking a break in the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the water source. Morrison had brought his own lunch, but he shared jerky and hardtack with Kit in the easy camaraderie that developed between cowboys working together under the Montana sun. The informal meal provided an opportunity for more personal conversation, and Kit found herself dreading the questions she was certain would come. "You mentioned growing up on a farm in Nebraska," Morrison began, his tone conversational, but his eyes alert. "What kind of operation was it? Cattle, crops, mixed farming?" Kit had prepared answers for such questions during her early weeks on the ranch, but Morrison's follow-up queries were more detailed and specific than what she'd typically encountered. He asked about soil conditions, growing seasons, marketing challenges, and dozens of other details that required knowledge she'd had to fabricate carefully to maintain her cover story. "Mostly corn and wheat," Kit replied, drawing on research she'd done during her journey west and conversations with actual Nebraska farmers she'd encountered. "Some cattle, but not enough to make a real business of it. Land wasn't quite right for large-scale ranching." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Southeast Nebraska's a tough country for cattle. Too much rainfall, not enough grass quality. Most successful operations there focus on crops and maybe some hogs. Makes sense your family would try farming first. The casual agreement should have been reassuring, but something in Morrison's tone suggested he was testing her knowledge rather than simply accepting her explanation. Kit felt the familiar tension returning as she realized this conversation was more complex than the simple getting acquainted discussion it appeared to be. "What brought you to Montana?" Kit asked, hoping to redirect the conversation toward Morrison's background rather than continuing to defend her own fabricated history. "Long way from Texas to Copper Creek Ranch." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time Kit saw something that might have been genuine emotion rather than careful calculation. "Family business went under," he said simply. "Drought, falling prices, some bad decisions by people who should have known better. When everything fell apart, I had to find work somewhere else." The explanation felt authentic in a way that Morrison's previous questions hadn't, and Kit found herself wondering if she'd been imagining the undercurrents of suspicion she detected in his behavior. Perhaps his intense observation style was simply the result of being careful in a new situation, or maybe he was naturally curious about his fellow workers. Her months of living in constant fear of discovery might have made her overly sensitive to normal social interactions. The afternoon's work proceeded smoothly as they finished treating the remaining steers and completed the documentation required for the ranch's medical records. Morrison's writing was neat and precise, reflecting education that went beyond what most cowboys possessed. His notes were thorough and accurate, capturing details that would be useful for future reference and demonstrating the kind of professional competence that explained why Marcus Whitfield had hired him directly. As they prepared to return to the ranch house, Morrison made an observation that sent ice through Kit's veins. "You handle needles and medical supplies like someone with training," he said casually while cleaning equipment. "Learn that from a doctor or just pick it up through experience?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Kit recognized it as potentially dangerous territory. Her skill with medical procedures came from her experience caring for her brother Daniel and other family members during illnesses that had plagued their Ohio community. She'd learned basic medical techniques from necessity rather than formal training, but applying those skills in her current disguise required careful explanation. "Picked up what I could from the ranch veterinarian and some books," Kit replied, keeping her voice steady while focusing on packing supplies. "Useful skills to have when you're working with animals that can't exactly tell you what's wrong." Morrison nodded agreement, but Kit caught him studying her hands as she worked. Her fingers were smaller and more delicate than those of most cowboys, despite months of hard labor that had calloused them and made them stronger. She'd learned to compensate by developing techniques that relied on precision rather than raw strength. But those same techniques might appear unusual to someone with medical training himself. The ride back to the ranch house passed in companionable silence, but Kit's mind raced as she tried to evaluate everything that had happened during the day. Morrison's questions had been more probing than casual conversation typically warranted, and his observations about her skills and techniques suggested he was paying very close attention to details that other cowboys had never noticed or commented upon. That evening in the mess hall, Kit found herself watching Morrison's interactions with the other ranch hands. He fit in easily with their conversations and demonstrated familiarity with the kind of crude humor and casual profanity that characterized bunkhouse life. Several of the cowboys seemed genuinely impressed by his knowledge and experience, and even Jake Sullivan appeared to be warming to the newcomer despite his initial resentment at being bypassed in the hiring process. Pete Donovan joined Kit at her usual table, carrying his plate of beans and beef that constituted the standard evening meal. The old cowboy's presence was reassuring, representing the stable relationships and familiar routines that had made Kit's life bearable during her months at Copper Creek Ranch. "How'd things go working with the new fellow?" Pete asked quietly, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by other hands. Sullivan was curious about how he handled himself with the cattle work. Kit considered her response carefully. "He knows what he's doing," she admitted. "Good with animals, careful with procedures, and asks intelligent questions. Seems like he'll fit in well enough." Pete nodded approvingly. "That's what Whitfield was hoping for, I expect. Man doesn't hire someone directly unless he's got particular plans for them. Word is Morrison might be getting groomed for some kind of supervisory position, maybe even assistant foreman if he proves himself." The information hit Kit like a physical blow. If Morrison was being considered for a leadership position, he would have even more opportunity to observe and evaluate the ranch hands under his potential supervision. An assistant foreman would be expected to know the background and capabilities of every cowboy on the ranch, conducting the kind of detailed assessment that could easily expose inconsistencies in Kit's carefully constructed identity. Sleep proved elusive that night as Kit lay in her narrow bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of cowboys settling in for the night. Morrison's bunk was only a few feet away, and she found herself hyper-aware of his presence, even when he appeared to be sleeping. The proximity that had never bothered her with other ranch hands felt threatening now, as though his mere presence in the bunkhouse increased the risk of discovery. The next morning brought an unexpected development that changed everything. Kit was saddling her horse for the day's assigned work when Morrison approached with an expression that was different from anything she'd seen before. Gone was the casual friendliness and professional curiosity. In its place was something that looked like determination mixed with what might have been sympathy. "Charlie," Morrison said quietly, positioning himself so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other hands preparing for their daily assignments. "I need to talk with you. Privately. There's something we need to discuss away from the others." Kit felt her mouth go dry as she recognized the tone of someone who had made a decision about a difficult situation. This wasn't a casual request for conversation or even a work-related discussion. Morrison's demeanor suggested he was preparing to address something serious and potentially dangerous for both of them. "What about?" Kit managed to ask, though she was certain she already knew the answer to her question. Morrison glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed, then met her eyes with an expression that was both sympathetic and implacable. "I think you know what about," he said softly. "We need to find somewhere we can talk without interruption, because what I have to say is going to change everything for both of us." Kit's hands trembled slightly as she finished adjusting her saddle, her mind racing through possibilities for escape or explanation that might salvage her situation. The 8 months of careful deception, gradual acceptance, and slowly built security were apparently about to collapse around her. Whatever Morrison had discovered or suspected, he was preparing to confront her with it directly. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north of here," Kit heard herself saying, though the words seemed to come from someone else. "We could ride out there on the pretext of checking winter supplies." Morrison nodded grimly. "That'll work. We can tell Sullivan we're doing equipment inventory for the winter months. Give us privacy to have the conversation that's been building since I arrived here." As they rode north toward the remote cabin that would serve as the setting for whatever confrontation Morrison had planned, Kit found herself wondering if her months of freedom were about to end in disaster. Everything she'd built, every relationship she'd formed, every bit of security she'd managed to create was balanced on the edge of whatever Morrison intended to reveal. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and harsh, in equal measure, much like the life Kit had created for herself through determination and deception. Soon she would learn whether that life could survive the challenge that Luke Morrison represented, or whether her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her with consequences she couldn't begin to imagine. The line shack sat in a grove of pine trees that provided shelter from the constant Montana wind, its weathered logs and tin roof, testament to decades of serving as refuge for cowboys. caught by sudden storms or needing a place to rest during long rides. Across the vast ranch, Kit's hands shook as she dismounted, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her carefully constructed life continued or came crashing down in ruin. Morrison tied his horse beside hers and approached the cabin door with the measured steps of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind. Kit followed reluctantly, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared for the confrontation that would either destroy her or somehow, impossibly, lead to understanding. Inside the small cabin, Morrison turned to face her with an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been compassion. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap, until finally he spoke the words that confirmed Kit's worst fears. "Your name isn't Charlie Brennan," Morrison said quietly. "I don't know what your real name is, but I know you're not the Nebraska farm boy you're pretending to be." Kit felt the blood drain from her face as 8 months of careful deception collapsed in an instant. Her mind raced through possible responses: denial, explanation, or desperate flight, but something in Morrison's tone suggested that further pretense would be pointless. He knew. The only question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge. "How long have you known?" Kit asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suspected from the first day," Morrison replied, settling onto a rough wooden chair and gesturing for Kit to do the same. "Little things at first, the way you move, how you handle tools, your voice when you think nobody's listening. Then yesterday, working with the cattle, I became certain." Kit remained standing, poised for flight despite knowing she had nowhere to run. "What gave me away?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Your hands when you were giving injections. You've had medical training, real training, not just what you'd pick up working with ranch animals. The way you positioned your fingers, controlled the pressure, managed the needle, that's someone who's worked with human patients, probably for years." The observation was devastatingly accurate. Kit's experience caring for her family and neighbors in Ohio had indeed given her medical skills that went far beyond typical ranch knowledge. She'd been careful to downplay her abilities, but apparently not careful enough to fool someone with Morrison's observational skills. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Your horse handling techniques are different from what most cowboys learn. You've got natural talent, but also formal training. Someone taught you to read horses the way educated people read books. That doesn't happen on hardscrabble Nebraska farms." Kit sank onto the other chair as she realized how thoroughly her deception had been penetrated. Details she'd thought were subtle had apparently been obvious to someone who knew what to look for. The careful performance that had fooled everyone else for 8 months had been transparent to Morrison from almost the moment they'd met. "Who are you?" Kit asked, her voice stronger now that the initial shock was passing. "Because you're not just some cowboy from Texas either." Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd known him, and the expression transformed his face completely. "My name really is Luke Morrison, and I really am from Texas. But you're right that I'm not just a cowboy. I'm a detective with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency." The revelation hit Kit like a physical blow. The Pinkerton Agency was famous throughout the West for tracking down criminals, solving complex cases, and conducting investigations that local law enforcement couldn't handle. If Morrison was a Pinkerton detective, then Kit's situation was far more serious than she'd imagined. "Who hired you?" Kit managed to ask. "What crime am I supposed to have committed?" Morrison leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "That's the interesting part. Nobody hired me to find you specifically. I'm here investigating something else entirely, a series of cattle thefts that have been plaguing ranches throughout Montana and Wyoming. Marcus Whitfield contacted the agency when he lost nearly 200 head over the past 6 months. Kit felt a mixture of relief and confusion. If Morrison wasn't here hunting her, then perhaps her situation wasn't as desperate as she'd feared. but his presence still represented a threat to the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. "Then why does it matter who I am?" Kit asked. "Because cattle thieves often use inside information," Morrison explained. "They know which herds to target, when ranches are most vulnerable, where to move stolen animals without detection. Someone working on the ranch might be providing information to the thieves, either voluntarily or unknowingly." The implication was clear and insulting. Morrison suspected that Kit's deception might be connected to the cattle thefts he was investigating. Her false identity made her an obvious candidate for suspicion, regardless of her actual innocence or involvement. "I'm not a cattle thief," Kit said firmly. "I've never stolen anything in my life, and I would never do anything to harm Mr. Whitfield or this ranch." Morrison studied her face carefully. "I believe you," he said finally. "But believing you and proving your innocence to others are two different things. Right now, you're the only person on this ranch living under a false identity. If the thefts continue and suspicion falls on someone here, you'll be the obvious target." Kit felt a chill as she realized the precarious position her deception had created. By living as Charlie Brennan, she'd made herself vulnerable to suspicion in ways she'd never considered. Her false identity, which had been a shield against her past, was now a weapon that could be used against her future. "What do you want from me?" Kit asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his words carefully. "I want to know who you really are and why you're hiding. I want to understand what brought you here and whether it has any connection to the thefts I'm investigating. And I want to know if you'll help me catch the real thieves before suspicion destroys both of us." The offer was unexpected and dangerous. Helping Morrison would mean revealing her true identity and the circumstances that had forced her to flee Ohio. But refusing might mean having her secret exposed anyway, with the added complication of being suspected of crimes she hadn't committed. "If I tell you the truth," Kit said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that you won't use it against me?" Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather wallet containing his Pinkerton credentials. "Because I'm more interested in solving my case than destroying your life. And because I think you might be the key to understanding what's really happening on this ranch." Kit examined the credentials, which appeared authentic and identified Morrison as a detective with 3 years' experience investigating livestock thefts and related crimes. His assignment to the Copper Creek Ranch case was officially documented, confirming his story about why he was there. "My real name is Catherine Brennan," Kit said finally, making the decision to trust him despite her fears. "Charlie was my brother. He died in an accident back in Ohio, and I took his identity to escape a situation that would have destroyed my life." Morrison listened without interruption as Kit told her story. The deaths of her parents, her brother's accident, the debts and social pressures that had made continuing her life as Catherine impossible. She explained how she'd learned the skills that had betrayed her identity, and why she'd chosen the dangerous path of living as a man rather than accepting the limited options available to women in her circumstances. When she finished, Morrison was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of what she'd revealed. His expression showed understanding rather than judgment, suggesting that her story had created sympathy rather than suspicion. "You're not the first woman I've encountered living under male identity," Morrison said finally. "The frontier creates situations that force people to make desperate choices. Your reasons for hiding are understandable and don't connect to the crimes I'm investigating." Kit felt a wave of relief, but Morrison's next words reminded her that her troubles were far from over. "However," he continued, "your situation is about to become much more complicated. Jake Sullivan is planning to get rid of you." The statement hit Kit like a slap. "What do you mean?" Morrison's expression grew grim. "Sullivan suspects you're hiding something, though he doesn't know what. He's been watching you closely and asking questions about your background. More importantly, He's been making inquiries about the Nebraska farm you claim to have grown up on. Kit felt her stomach drop. What kind of inquiries? Telegraph messages to local authorities, requests for records, attempts to verify the story you've been telling. Sullivan's suspicious. Nature and his resentment about my being hired over his objections have made him determined to find something wrong with one of us. Since he can't attack me directly, he's focusing on you. The news explained the tension Kit had sensed around Sullivan lately and the feeling that she was being watched more closely than usual. Her instincts had been correct. Her position on the ranch was indeed becoming precarious, though not for the reasons she'd initially feared. How long before he discovers the truth? Kit asked. Morrison shook his head. Hard to say. Records from small Nebraska farms aren't always well maintained, and telegraph communication can be slow and unreliable. But Sullivan's persistent, and eventually he'll find someone who can tell him that Charlie Brennan died in Ohio, not Nebraska. Kit felt trapped between impossible choices. Continuing her deception meant facing eventual discovery by Sullivan, who would have no sympathy for her circumstances and every reason to use her exposure to advance his own position. But revealing her identity voluntarily meant giving up the only security and independence she'd managed to achieve. There might be another option, Morrison said, apparently reading her thoughts. But it would require taking some significant risks and trusting me completely. Kit looked at him warily. What kind of option? Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private despite their isolation. Help me catch the cattle thieves. Use your position and knowledge of ranch operations to gather information and identify suspicious activities. In exchange, I'll protect your identity and help you establish a more secure position here. The proposal was both tempting and terrifying. Working with Morrison would give her an ally against Sullivan's suspicions, but it would also involve her in dangerous activities that could lead to even worse consequences if discovered. What makes you think I can help catch cattle thieves? Kit asked. Because you see everything and everyone trusts you, Morrison replied. Cowboys talk around you because they think of you as harmless. You have access to information about ranch operations, schedules, and personnel that would take me months to gather. And your medical skills give you reasons to be in different parts of the ranch without arousing suspicion. Kit considered the proposal while studying Morrison's face for signs of deception or hidden motives. His offer seemed genuine, but accepting it would mean abandoning the low-profile existence that had kept her safe for 8 months. If I agree to help you, Kit said slowly, what exactly would you expect me to do? Morrison pulled a small notebook from his pocket and showed her several pages of observations he'd already recorded. Document unusual activities, particularly involving cattle movements or visits by outsiders. Pay attention to conversations among the hands, especially anything related to cattle sales or transportation. Most importantly, help me understand the relationships and rivalries among the ranch personnel. The task seemed manageable and not immediately dangerous, but Kit understood that any involvement in Morrison's investigation would increase her visibility and risk of exposure. She would be trading her current precarious security for active participation in events she couldn't control. There's something else you need to know, Morrison added. The cattle thefts aren't random. Someone is selecting specific animals, taking them at strategic times, and moving them through organized networks. This isn't an opportunistic crime. It's a sophisticated operation that requires detailed planning and inside knowledge. Kit felt a chill as she realized the implications. If the thefts were as organized as Morrison suggested, then the criminals involved were probably dangerous and would respond violently to any threat to their operation. Helping Morrison wouldn't just risk her disguise, it could risk her life. Before Kit could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Morrison moved quickly to the window and peered through the grimy glass, his body tensing as he identified the riders. Sullivan and 2 other hands, Morrison said quietly. They're heading this way, and they don't look like they're just passing through. Kit felt panic rising as she realized they were about to be discovered in a situation that would be difficult to explain. 2 ranch hands meeting privately in an isolated cabin would raise questions neither of them was prepared to answer. Morrison thought quickly. "Follow my lead," he said, moving to a storage cabinet and pulling out several pieces of equipment. "We're conducting winter inventory, checking supplies and equipment for the cold months ahead." Within seconds, Morrison had scattered papers and tools across the small table, creating the appearance of men engaged in routine maintenance planning. Kit joined the deception, examining harnesses and tools with the practiced efficiency of someone checking equipment condition. The sound of boots on the cabin's wooden steps announced Sullivan's arrival moments before he pushed through the door. Without knocking, his dark eyes immediately scanned the cabin, taking in the scattered equipment and papers with obvious suspicion. "Morrison, Charlie," Sullivan said curtly. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here today." Morrison looked up from the harness he'd been examining. "Mr. Whitfield wanted an inventory of winter supplies at all the line shacks, making sure we're prepared before the weather turns bad." Sullivan's gaze moved between Morrison and Kit, clearly looking for signs of behavior that didn't match their stated purpose. The 2 hands who'd accompanied him remained outside, but Kit could see them through the open door, their position suggesting they were prepared for trouble. "Find anything interesting?" Sullivan asked, his tone carrying implications that had nothing to do with equipment inventory. "Standard maintenance issues," Morrison replied smoothly. "Some harnesses need repair, we're low on medical supplies, and the roof has a leak that should be fixed before winter." Sullivan approached the table and examined the papers Morrison had. Prepared, his suspicion evident despite the apparent legitimacy of their work. Kit continued checking equipment, hoping her nervousness wouldn't betray the true nature of their meeting. "Charlie," Sullivan said suddenly, "walk outside with me. I want to discuss your work assignments for next week." The request sounded innocent, but Kit recognized it as a separation tactic designed to allow Sullivan to question her without Morrison's presence. Whatever suspicions the foreman harbored about her identity, he was apparently ready to act on them. Kit glanced at Morrison, who gave an almost imperceptible nod that might have been encouragement or warning. She followed Sullivan outside, her mind racing as she prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether her secret remained safe or her carefully constructed world finally collapsed around her. The November air was a bit sharp and cold. As Kit followed Jake Sullivan away from the line shack, her boots crunching through frost-covered grass that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the afternoon sun. Sullivan's 2 companions, Red Murphy and Dale Carson, both longtime ranch hands who served as the foreman's unofficial enforcers, positioned themselves strategically to block any escape route back to the cabin where Morrison remained. Sullivan stopped beside a large boulder that provided natural seating and turned to face Kit with an expression that mixed satisfaction with barely controlled anger. His dark eyes held the gleam of a predator who had finally cornered prey after a long hunt, and Kit felt her stomach clench as she realized this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Morrison arrived on the ranch. "Sit down, Charlie," Sullivan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "We need to have a little conversation about some inconsistencies I've discovered in your employment records." Kit remained standing, instinctively choosing the mobility that might give her options if the situation deteriorated rapidly. "What kind of inconsistencies, Mr. Sullivan?" Sullivan's smile was cold and humorless. "The kind that suggests you've been lying to everyone on this ranch since the day you arrived. The kind that makes a man wonder what else you might be lying about." The foreman reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded telegram, the yellow paper crackling in the cold air as he unfolded it with deliberate slowness. Kit's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the official formatting that indicated communication with authorities outside Montana. "Interesting responses I got when I started checking up on your background," Sullivan continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone savoring a moment of triumph. "Turns out the county clerk in southeastern Nebraska has some very detailed records about land ownership and family histories." Kit forced herself to remain calm despite the terror flooding through her system. "I never claimed my family owned much land. We were tenant farmers and worked other people's property." Sullivan's laugh was harsh and mocking. "That's the beauty of it, Charlie. See, I didn't just check land records. I checked death certificates, burial records, church registers, all the places that keep track of who lived where and when they died." The telegram rustled in Sullivan's hands as he prepared to deliver what Kit was certain would be devastating information. She found herself calculating distances to the horses, wondering if desperate flight might be possible despite the odds against success. "Charlie Brennan," Sullivan read from the telegram with theatrical emphasis, "died in Medina County, Ohio, on March 15, 1884. Crushed by an overturned wagon while attempting to rescue a neighbor's child. Survived by one sister, Catherine Brennan, who disappeared shortly after his funeral." The words hit Kit like physical blows, each detail confirming that her carefully constructed deception had been completely penetrated. Sullivan's investigation had not only discovered Charlie's death, but also identified her real name and connection to her brother. Her secret was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair or explanation. "So the question becomes," Sullivan continued, folding the telegram and returning it to his jacket, "who exactly are you, and what happened to the real Catherine Brennan?" Kit's mind raced through possible responses, but every option seemed to lead toward disaster. Confession would confirm Sullivan's suspicions and leave her vulnerable to whatever revenge he planned to extract for her deception. Continued denial would be pointless given the evidence he'd assembled. Flight would brand her as guilty of whatever crimes he chose to imagine. "Well," Sullivan demanded when Kit remained silent, "you got an explanation for how a dead man from Ohio ended up working cattle in Montana?" Before Kit could formulate a response, Red Murphy spoke up from his position near the horses. "Maybe she's the sister who disappeared. Maybe Catherine Brennan figured out how to become Charlie Brennan when times got tough." Sullivan's eyes lit up with cruel satisfaction. "Now that's an interesting theory. Red would explain a lot of things that never quite added up about our mysterious cowboy here." Kit felt the walls of her carefully constructed world collapsing around her as the three men began discussing her identity as though she weren't present. Their speculation was becoming more accurate with each exchange, and she realized that denial would no longer serve any purpose. "You're right," Kit said quietly, deciding that dignity in defeat was preferable to continued humiliation. "My name is Catherine Brennan. Charlie was my brother, and I took his identity after he died." Sullivan's triumph was immediate and visible. "Finally, some honesty. Now we're getting somewhere. Question is, what other lies have you been telling, and what crimes might you be running from?" The accusation of criminal activity stung because it reflected exactly the kind of suspicion Kit had feared from the beginning. Her deception, which had been motivated by desperation rather than criminal intent, would inevitably be interpreted as evidence of guilt by men like Sullivan, who saw the world in terms of predators and prey. "I haven't committed any crimes," Kit said firmly. "I disguised myself because I had no other options for survival. Women don't get hired for ranch work, and I needed employment that would let me disappear from my previous life." Sullivan's skepticism was evident in his expression and tone. "Disappear from what, exactly? What were you running from that was so terrible you had to steal a dead man's identity?" Kit hesitated, knowing that explaining her circumstances would require revealing details that these men might use against her. But continued silence would only fuel their suspicions and potentially lead to worse consequences than the truth. After Charlie died, I was left with debts I couldn't pay and social pressures I couldn't handle, Kit explained. The community expected me to marry quickly or face destitution. The men who were interested in marrying me were more interested in our land than in me personally. Red Murphy snort with derision. So you ran away because you didn't want to get married? That's your big terrible secret. It's more complicated than that, Kit replied, stung by his dismissive tone. One particular man, Thomas Hartwell, made it clear that he intended to have our property regardless of my feelings about marriage. When I refused his proposal, he began pressuring others in the community to force me into accepting him. Sullivan leaned forward with obvious interest. What kind of pressure? Kit felt herself flushing as she recalled the humiliation and fear that had characterized her final weeks in Ohio. He spread rumors about my moral character, suggesting that a woman living alone was inherently unsuitable and dangerous to community standards. He convinced the bank to call in loans early and persuaded merchants to extend credit only to him rather than to me directly. Sounds like normal business practices to me, Dale Carson commented. Man sees an opportunity, he takes it. That's how things work. It became more than business when he started making threats, Kit continued, her voice growing stronger as anger replaced fear. Hartwell made it clear that if I didn't accept his proposal voluntarily, he would find ways to force me into compliance. When I still refused, he began talking about having me declared mentally incompetent so he could assume control of my property as my legal guardian. The three men exchanged glances that suggested they found her story plausible but not particularly sympathetic. In their world, women who couldn't protect themselves deserved whatever happened to them, and Kit's desperate solution would be seen as deception rather than survival. So you stole your dead brother's clothes and ran away to Montana, Sullivan summarized. And you've been lying to everyone here for 8 months, collecting wages under false pretenses, violating the trust that Mr. Whitfield placed in you when he hired you. Kit felt the injustice of his characterization burning in her chest. I've worked harder than anyone else on this ranch. I've earned every penny of my wages, and I've never done anything to betray Mr. Whitfield's trust in my abilities. Sullivan's smile was cold and predatory. Your abilities maybe, but not your identity. And that kind of deception makes a man wonder what else you might be capable of. The implication was clear and frightening. Sullivan was building a case that Kit's identity deception indicated criminal tendencies that might extend to other activities. She realized he was preparing to accuse her of involvement in whatever problems the ranch had been experiencing. What are you suggesting, Mr. Sullivan? I'm suggesting that someone who lies about something as basic as their identity might lie about other things too, Sullivan replied. Someone who infiltrates a ranch under false pretenses might have reasons for being here that go beyond just earning honest wages. Kit felt ice forming in her stomach as she began to understand Sullivan's strategy. He was preparing to make her a scapegoat for whatever criminal activities had been plaguing the ranch. Her false identity made her a perfect target for suspicion, and Sullivan clearly intended to exploit that vulnerability. I've never done anything dishonest except lie about my name, Kit said desperately. Everything else about my work here has been completely legitimate. Sullivan stood up from the boulder and began pacing in a pattern that suggested he was building toward a climax he'd been planning for some time. That's what makes this so interesting, Catherine. See, we've had some problems around here lately. Problems that require inside knowledge to pull off successfully. Kit's worst fears were becoming reality as Sullivan began connecting her deception to crimes she knew nothing about. She realized that defending herself would be difficult when her very presence on the ranch was based on lies that these men would never forgive or understand. Mr. Sullivan, I don't know what problems you're referring to, but I haven't been involved in any criminal activities. I've done my job and kept to myself. Sullivan stopped pacing and turned to face her with an expression of savage satisfaction. Really? Then maybe you can explain why cattle have been disappearing from sections of the ranch where you've been working. Maybe you can explain why these thefts always seem to happen when you're in the area. The accusation was devastating because Kit couldn't prove her innocence of crimes she hadn't known were occurring. Her work assignments had taken her throughout the ranch, and if cattle had been stolen from areas where she'd been working, the correlation would appear damning regardless of her actual involvement. I haven't stolen any cattle, Kit said firmly. I wouldn't even know how to move stolen animals or find buyers for them. Red Murphy laughed harshly. Wouldn't you? Seems to me someone smart enough to steal a dead man's identity might be smart enough to figure out cattle rustling. The logic was circular and impossible to refute. Her intelligence and resourcefulness, which had enabled her survival, were now being presented as evidence of criminal capability. Kit realized she was trapped in a situation where every positive quality could be reinterpreted as proof of guilt. You're wrong about me, Kit said, though she could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. I came here to work honestly and build a new life. I've never stolen anything from this ranch. Sullivan approached her with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But that's not really the point anymore, is it, Catherine? Kit looked at him warily, recognizing that the conversation was taking a new and potentially more dangerous direction. What do you mean? Sullivan's smile was predatory and cruel. I mean that whether you're guilty or innocent of cattle theft doesn't matter much now. What matters is that you're a woman who's been living illegally on this ranch, deceiving your employer and fellow workers, violating laws about fraud and misrepresentation. Kit felt the trap closing around her as she realized Sullivan wasn't primarily interested in solving crimes. He was interested in destroying her, for reasons that had more to do with his own psychology than with ranch security. Even if you're innocent of rustling, Sullivan continued, you're guilty of fraud, impersonation, and obtaining employment under false pretenses. Those are serious crimes, Catherine. The kind that could get you years in prison if the authorities decide to prosecute. The threat was clear and terrifying. Even if Kit could prove her innocence of cattle theft, Sullivan was prepared to destroy her life through legal action that would expose her deception and subject her to imprisonment. She was trapped between accusations she couldn't disprove and charges she couldn't deny. What do you want from me? Kit asked, recognizing that Sullivan's elaborate buildup was leading towards some kind of demand or ultimatum. Sullivan's expression shifted to one of mock sympathy. That's the beauty of this situation, Catherine. I'm prepared to be reasonable. About your difficulties, there might be a way to resolve this matter quietly, without involving territorial authorities or creating embarrassment for Mr. Whitfield. Kit felt her skin crawl as she recognized the tone of someone preparing to make an indecent proposal. Sullivan's interest in her was apparently not limited to professional concerns, and she realized she was about to face pressures that went far beyond questions about her identity or work performance. What kind of resolution? Kit asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Sullivan stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made his intentions unmistakable. A smart woman like you should be able to figure that out. I'm willing to forget about your little deception, keep your secret safe, even protect you from any cattle rustling accusations that might arise. All you need to do is show proper appreciation for my discretion. The proposition was exactly what Kit had feared: sexual coercion disguised as a business arrangement. Sullivan was using her vulnerability to extort compliance with his desires, knowing that she had few options for resistance or escape. Before Kit could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Morrison's emergence from the line shack. His eyes immediately took in the configuration of the group, and the tension in Kit's posture, and his expression hardened as he apparently recognized the nature of the confrontation. "Everything all right out here?" Morrison asked, his voice carefully neutral but his body language suggesting readiness for trouble. Sullivan turned toward Morrison with obvious irritation at the interruption. "Just having a private conversation with Charlie here about some employment issues. Nothing that concerns you, Morrison." Morrison's eyes met Kit's briefly, and she saw understanding and determination in his gaze. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be facing Sullivan's threats alone. The alliance they'd formed in the cabin was about to be tested under the worst possible circumstances. "Funny thing about employment issues," Morrison said conversationally. "They have a way of concerning everyone when they involve serious accusations or threats." Sullivan's expression darkened as he realized Morrison wasn't going to withdraw and leave him to continue his coercion privately. The foreman was now facing a situation where his threats and propositions might become public knowledge, complicating his plans considerably. The confrontation that Kit had feared was about to become something larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Her secret was exposed, but the battle for her future was just beginning. The tension crackled like lightning about to strike as Morrison stepped closer to the group, his keen eyes assessing the dynamics between Sullivan and Kit with the practiced observation of a detective who had witnessed similar confrontations before. Red Murphy and Dale Carson shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that their simple intimidation mission had suddenly become complicated by the presence of an unknown variable. Sullivan's face flushed red with anger at Morrison's interference. "I told you this doesn't concern you, Morrison. Walk away while you still can." Morrison's expression remained calm, but Kit caught the subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was preparing for potential violence. "Actually, Jake, I think it concerns me quite a bit. See, I've been listening to your conversation from inside the cabin, and I'm finding your accusations very interesting." Kit felt a mixture of relief and terror as she realized Morrison had overheard Sullivan's threats and propositions. While his support gave her an ally, his intervention also escalated the situation beyond any possibility of quiet resolution. "You were eavesdropping?" Sullivan demanded his authority be challenged in front of his men in a way that would require decisive response to maintain his position. Morrison shrugged casually. "Hard not to overhear when someone's making threats and accusations that loud. Especially when those accusations involve crimes I happen to know quite a bit about." Sullivan's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What's that supposed to mean?" Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew his Pinkerton credentials, holding them where all four men could see the official documentation. "It means I'm Detective Luke Morrison of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and I'm here investigating the cattle thefts you just accused Catherine of committing." The revelation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. His face went pale as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Red Murphy and Dale Carson exchanged worried glances, understanding that threatening a federal detective carried consequences far beyond ranch politics. "You're bluffing," Sullivan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Whitfield would have told me if he'd hired Pinkertons." Morrison's smile was cold and professional. Would he? Or would he have wanted to conduct a discreet investigation without alerting potential suspects among his own employees? Kit watched Sullivan's confidence crumble as the implications of Morrison's identity became clear. The foreman had been operating under the assumption that he controlled the situation completely, but the presence of a federal detective changed everything about the power dynamics. "Even if you are a Pinkerton," Sullivan said desperately, "that doesn't change the fact that this woman has been defrauding Mr. Whitfield for 8 months. She's violated federal laws about identity fraud and obtaining employment under false pretenses." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. Catherine has indeed been living under false identity, which is technically illegal. Of course, the circumstances that forced her to take such desperate measures are also relevant to any potential prosecution." Kit felt hope stirring as Morrison seemed prepared to defend her actions, But she knew the situation remained precarious. Her deception was still a crime regardless of her motivations, and Sullivan could still cause tremendous damage to her life, even if he couldn't control the ultimate outcome. What circumstances could possibly justify identity fraud? Sullivan demanded. Morrison's expression hardened as he apparently decided to reveal information he'd learned during their conversation in the cabin. The circumstances of a woman fleeing sexual coercion and economic manipulation by a powerful man who intended to force her into marriage through threats and intimidation. Kit's stomach clenched as Morrison exposed the details of her past, making her vulnerability public in a way that felt like another violation. But she recognized that he was attempting to reframe her deception as survival rather than criminal intent. Sullivan's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "You expect us to believe some sob story about unwanted marriage proposals? Women have been dealing with marriage pressure since the beginning of time without resorting to criminal fraud, have they?" Morrison asked quietly. "Or have most women simply accepted situations they couldn't escape because society offered them? No alternatives?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to fundamental assumptions about women's roles and choices. Kit realized that Morrison was attempting to shift the conversation from her specific crimes to broader questions about the limited options available to women in desperate circumstances. Red Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "This is getting too complicated. For me, Jake, maybe we should just report what we found and let Mr. Whitfield decide what to do about it." Sullivan turned on his subordinate with fury. "We're not reporting anything until I decide what gets reported. This is still my investigation, and I'll determine how it proceeds." Morrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "Your investigation? I wasn't aware that ranch foremen conducted criminal investigations. That's typically the responsibility of law enforcement agencies." Kit watched Sullivan struggle to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him rapidly. His authority was being challenged by a federal detective. His subordinates were expressing doubts, and his plans for coercing her were being exposed publicly. "I have the authority to investigate crimes affecting this ranch," Sullivan insisted. "Employee fraud and cattle theft are ranch security matters that fall under my jurisdiction." Morrison's expression became dangerously cold. "Actually, Jake, cattle theft is a federal crime that falls under my jurisdiction. And now I'm very curious about why you're so eager to control this particular investigation." The implication was clear and devastating. Morrison was suggesting that Sullivan's interest in suppressing the investigation might indicate his own involvement in the crimes rather than genuine concern about ranch security. Sullivan's face went white as he realized the trap he'd walked into. By attempting to control the investigation and silence Kit, he'd made himself appear suspicious to a federal detective who was trained to recognize such behavior patterns. "You can't seriously suspect me of cattle theft," Sullivan protested. "I've worked for this ranch for 12 years. My loyalty to Mr. Whitfield is beyond question." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're more interested in covering up crimes than solving them. It looks like you're using Catherine's identity issues to distract attention from the real criminals." Kit watched in fascination as Morrison systematically dismantled Sullivan's position. The detective was using the foreman's own tactics against him, turning accusations and suspicions into weapons that highlighted Sullivan's suspicious behavior. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "your immediate assumption that Catherine must be involved in cattle theft, despite having no evidence beyond her identity deception, suggests you're either incompetent as an investigator or deliberately trying to frame an innocent person." Dale Carson stepped backward, clearly wanting to distance himself from a confrontation that was spiraling beyond his comfort level. "Maybe we should all calm down and think about this rationally." Sullivan whirled toward Carson with rage. "Don't you dare abandon me now, Dale. We've been planning this for weeks." The slip was immediate and devastating. Sullivan had just admitted that his confrontation with Kit wasn't a spontaneous response to discovered evidence, but a premeditated action that had been planned well in advance. Morrison pounced on the admission immediately. Planning what for? Weeks, Jake? Planning to frame Catherine for cattle theft? Planning to use her vulnerability for personal gain? Planning to cover up your own criminal activities? Kit felt the pieces falling into place as she realized that Sullivan's behavior had been even more calculated and malicious than she'd initially understood. His investigation of her background hadn't been motivated by security concerns. It had been part of a deliberate plan to make her a scapegoat for crimes he might be committing himself. Sullivan's desperation became palpable as he realized how completely his position had collapsed. "You're twisting my words, Morrison. I was planning to investigate suspicious activities, not frame anyone." Morrison's laugh was cold and professional. "Really? Then explain why you were offering to protect Catherine from cattle theft accusations in exchange for sexual favors. That sounds less like investigation and more like extortion." Red Murphy's face went pale as he apparently realized for the first time what kind of confrontation he'd been brought to witness. "Jesus, Jake, you didn't tell us about any of that. You said we were just going to question her about employment fraud." Kit watched Sullivan's support system crumble as his subordinates understood they'd been manipulated into participating in something far worse than they'd agreed to. The foreman's carefully constructed plan was disintegrating in real time. "It's not extortion," Sullivan protested weakly. "I was offering her a way to resolve her legal problems quietly." Morrison's expression showed the contempt of a professional law enforcement officer confronting obvious corruption. "Jake, I've been a detective for 3 years, and I've seen every variation of sexual coercion and extortion. What you were doing has a name, and it's a federal crime." Kit realized that Morrison was building a case against Sullivan that could send the foreman to prison for years. The man who had threatened to destroy her life was now facing the possibility of his own destruction through the very legal system he'd intended to use against her. Sullivan seemed to recognize his desperate situation because his demeanor shifted from aggressive authority to pleading desperation. "Morrison, you don't understand the pressures I'm under. Whitfield's been demanding results on the cattle thefts, and I needed a suspect to satisfy him." The confession was complete and damning. Sullivan had just admitted that he'd planned to frame Kit not because he believed she was guilty, but because he needed a scapegoat to protect his own position. Morrison nodded grimly. "And when framing her for theft didn't seem sufficient, you decided to add sexual coercion to ensure her compliance and silence. That's 2 federal crimes, Jake, possibly more depending on what else I uncover during my investigation." Kit felt a profound sense of justice as she watched Sullivan face the consequences of his own actions. The man who had terrorized her with threats of imprisonment was now confronting the reality of his own criminal liability. But Sullivan's desperation made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. Kit saw his hand move toward the gun at his hip and realized that cornered men often chose violence when legal options disappeared. "Jake," she said quietly, drawing his attention away from Morrison, "it doesn't have to get worse than it already is. You can cooperate with Detective Morrison's investigation and face reasonable consequences, or you can make everything worse by doing something violent and stupid." Sullivan's eyes focused on her with the hatred of someone who blamed her for his own self-created problems. "This is all your fault, you lying bitch. If you hadn't come here with your deceptions and complications, none of this would have happened." Morrison stepped between Sullivan and Kit, his own hand moving to his weapon. "Actually, Jake, this is happening because you chose to commit crimes and then try to cover them up by victimizing an innocent woman. Catherine's identity deception didn't force you to steal cattle or attempt sexual extortion." The moral clarity of Morrison's statement highlighted the fundamental difference between Kit's desperate survival tactics and Sullivan's deliberate criminality. Her deception had harmed no one except potentially herself, while Sullivan's actions had victimized others for personal gain. "You don't know what you're talking about," Sullivan snarled. "You don't know the pressures of running a ranch this size, dealing with owners who demand impossible results, managing cowboys who respect nothing but force." Morrison's expression showed no sympathy. "I know that pressure doesn't justify crime. Jake, I know that authority doesn't give you the right to victimize people under your supervision. And I know that you're about to make a decision that will determine whether you face trial as a criminal or as a violent criminal." Kit realized they had reached the moment where Sullivan would either surrender to inevitable justice or attempt a desperate escape that could only end in disaster. The foreman's grip on his gun was tightening, and his expression showed the wild look of someone who had lost all rational perspective. Red Murphy and Dale Carson had backed away from Sullivan, clearly unwilling to participate in whatever violent action he might be contemplating. Their abandonment left the foreman isolated and facing the consequences of his actions alone. "Jake," Kit said softly, "think about your family. Think about your future. Don't destroy what's left of your life for the sake of pride or fear." Sullivan's laugh was bitter and desperate. "What life? What future? You've destroyed everything I worked for, everything I built here." Morrison shook his head firmly. "You destroyed it yourself, Jake. Your choices, your crimes, your decision to victimize an innocent woman instead of doing your job honestly." The moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Kit could see Sullivan weighing his options, calculating whether desperate violence might somehow salvage his position or provide an escape from the justice that awaited him. Then, suddenly, the sound of approaching horses broke the tension as a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Even at a distance, Kit could identify Marcus Whitfield's distinctive figure leading what appeared to be several other mounted men toward their location. Sullivan's face went ashen as he realized that his employer was approaching a scene that would be impossible to explain or control. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just his immediate fate, but the future of everyone involved in the confrontation. The arrival of additional witnesses meant that violence would be witnessed and documented, making Sullivan's situation even more desperate, but also potentially more dangerous as he faced the complete collapse of every plan and hope he'd harbored. Kit braced herself for whatever desperate action Sullivan might attempt as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder and the moment of final reckoning approached with the inevitability of an avalanche. Marcus Whitfield rode at the head of a group that included not only ranch hands, but also two men in formal business attire whose bearing suggested they were officials of some kind. As they drew closer, Kit could see that one of them wore a badge that glinted silver in the afternoon sun, likely a territorial marshal or federal authority. The other appeared to be a lawyer or government representative, based on his expensive clothing and the leather satchel secured to his saddle. Sullivan's desperation intensified as he recognized that his situation had just become exponentially worse. What had begun as a private confrontation designed to coerce Kit into submission was now unfolding in front of his employer and what appeared to be law enforcement officials. His hand trembled on his gun as he calculated increasingly desperate options for escape or salvage. Morrison immediately stepped forward, positioning himself where he could address the approaching group while maintaining visual contact with Sullivan. "Mr. Whitfield," he called out, "I'm glad you're here. We've had some significant developments in my investigation." Whitfield's expression was grim as he surveyed the scene, his foreman standing apart from his subordinates, a woman he knew as Charlie Brennan, but who was clearly something other than she appeared, and tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The ranch owner had built his empire through shrewd assessment of complex situations, and Kit could see him evaluating the dynamics before him with the calculating intelligence that had made him successful. "Detective Morrison," Whitfield replied. "Formally, Marshal Thompson and Attorney General Harrison have come to review the progress of your investigation. I hope you have substantial findings to report." Kit felt her heart sink as she realized the stakes had just escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. The presence of a territorial marshal and the attorney general meant that whatever happened next would have implications far beyond the boundaries of Copper Creek Ranch. Her deception, Sullivan's crimes, and Morrison's investigation were about to become matters of territorial law and policy. Marshal Thompson was a weathered man in his 50s with the kind of steady presence that came from decades of dealing with frontier violence and corruption. His eyes immediately focused on Sullivan's position and the foreman's obvious agitation, recognizing the signs of someone preparing for desperate action. "Gentlemen," the marshal said calmly, "I suggest everyone keep their hands visible and away from weapons while we sort out whatever situation has developed here." Sullivan's face flushed red with humiliation as he realized he was being treated as a potential threat by federal law enforcement. His authority on the ranch, which had seemed absolute just hours earlier, was now revealed as meaningless in the presence of real governmental power. Attorney General Harrison was younger than Kit had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested he'd risen to his position through competence rather than political connections. His attention moved systematically between the participants in the confrontation. APPARENTL, while cataloging details for future reference. "Detective Morrison," Harrison said formally, "perhaps you could brief us on your findings and explain the current situation." Morrison nodded professionally. "Certainly, sir. My investigation into cattle thefts on Copper Creek Ranch has uncovered evidence of criminal conspiracy involving ranch personnel. More immediately, I've just witnessed Foreman Jake Sullivan attempting to extort sexual favors from a ranch employee through threats of false prosecution." The accusation hung in the air like a gunshot. Whitfield's expression darkened with anger as he realized that his trusted foreman was being accused of serious federal crimes. Sullivan seemed to shrink physically as he understood that his reputation and career were being destroyed in front of the most powerful men in the territory. "That's a serious allegation, Detective," Marshal Thompson said quietly. "Do you have evidence to support it?" Morrison gestured toward Red Murphy and Dale Carson, both of whom looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized they were about to become witnesses in a federal investigation. These men were present during Sullivan's threats and can testify to what they heard. Additionally, the victim herself can provide testimony about the attempted extortion. Kit felt all eyes turning toward her as she became the focal point of what was rapidly becoming a formal legal proceeding. Her carefully maintained disguise was about to be exposed to the highest levels of territorial authority, but she realized that Morrison's strategy was to frame her deception as part of Sullivan's criminal behavior rather than an independent crime. "The employee in question," Morrison continued, "has been working under an assumed identity for reasons related to her personal safety. Her real name is Catherine Brennan, and she took her deceased brother's identity to escape sexual coercion and economic manipulation in Ohio." Attorney General Harrison's eyebrows rose with interest. "She? Are you telling us that this ranch hand is actually a woman?" Morrison nodded gravely. "Yes, sir. Catherine Brennan has been working successfully as a cowboy for 8 months, demonstrating exceptional skill and dedication. Her deception harmed no one and was motivated entirely by desperate circumstances." Kit watched Whitfield's face as he processed this information. The ranch owner's initial shock gave way to something that might have been grudging respect as he apparently reassessed her performance in light of the additional challenges she'd been facing. "Miss Brennan," Whitfield said formally, "is Detective Morrison's account accurate? Have you been working on my ranch under false identity?" Kit stepped forward, knowing that this moment would determine her future in ways she couldn't predict. "Yes, sir, Mr. Whitfield. Everything Detective Morrison said is true. I took my brother's identity because I had no other options for survival." Whitfield studied her face with the intense scrutiny of someone evaluating a complex business proposition. And your work performance, your skills and dedication, have been exceptional, Morrison interjected. Catherine has consistently been one of your most reliable and skilled employees. Her contributions to ranch operations have been significant and valuable. Sullivan could no longer contain his desperation and anger. She's a fraud and a liar, he burst out. You can't trust anything she says or does. She's been deceiving everyone here for months. Marshal Thompson's attention focused sharply on Sullivan. And you responded to this deception by attempting sexual extortion? That seems like a disproportionate reaction to employment fraud. The marshal's observation highlighted the fundamental disproportion between Kit's survival tactics and Sullivan's criminal response. Her deception had been defensive and harm-reducing, while his actions had been predatory and exploitative. Attorney General Harrison pulled out a notebook and began recording details. Detective Morrison, what evidence do you have regarding cattle thefts and potential conspiracy? Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew his own notebook containing observations he'd gathered during his weeks on the ranch. Sullivan has been systematically diverting investigation efforts away from certain areas of the ranch and certain personnel. He's shown unusual knowledge of theft patterns and has been eager to blame the crimes on ranch hands who couldn't effectively defend themselves. Kit realized that Morrison had been building a case against Sullivan that went far beyond the immediate confrontation. The detective had apparently identified patterns of behavior that suggested the foreman's involvement in the very crimes he was supposed to be preventing. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Sullivan's immediate response to discovering Catherine's identity was to use it as leverage for personal gain rather than reporting it through proper channels. This behavior suggests he's more interested in exploitation than law enforcement. Red Murphy stepped forward hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but apparently deciding that honesty was his best option. Marshal, I need to tell you that Jake's been acting strange for months. Making secret trips off the ranch, meeting with people he won't identify, getting angry when anyone asks questions about missing cattle. The testimony from Sullivan's own subordinate was devastating. Murphy's observations provided external corroboration for Morrison's suspicions about the foreman's involvement in criminal activities. Dale Carson nodded reluctantly. Red's right. Jake's been different lately. Secretive, paranoid, angry all the time. And he's been pushing hard to blame the thefts on ranch hands instead of looking for outside involvement. Sullivan's face went pale as he realized that his own men were providing evidence against him. His careful efforts to control information and direct suspicion were being exposed by the very people he'd trusted to support his version of events. Whitfield's expression showed the cold anger of someone who'd been betrayed by a trusted employee. Jake, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response to these charges? Sullivan's desperation reached a breaking point. Instead of responding to his employer's question, he suddenly drew his gun and pointed it directly at Kit. None of this would have happened if she hadn't come here with her lies and complications, he snarled. I'm not going to prison because of some lying bitch who doesn't belong here. The sudden appearance of Sullivan's weapon transformed the confrontation into a life-threatening crisis. Marshal Thompson immediately drew his own gun while shouting commands for everyone to take cover. Morrison lunged toward Kit, attempting to shield her from Sullivan's weapon while drawing his own firearm. But before anyone could fire, Pete Donovan appeared from behind the line shack where he'd apparently been watching the confrontation develop. The old cowboy moved with surprising speed for his age, striking Sullivan's gun arm with a heavy piece of firewood that sent the weapon flying through the air. Enough, Jake, Pete said firmly as Sullivan stumbled and fell. You've disgraced yourself and this ranch enough for one day. Kit stared in amazement as she realized that Pete had been nearby throughout the confrontation, probably keeping watch in case his intervention became necessary. The old cowboy's loyalty and protective instincts had potentially saved her life at a moment when everything seemed lost. Marshal, Thompson quickly secured Sullivan's weapon while Attorney General Harrison observed the foreman's collapse with professional interest. Sullivan's desperate attempt at violence had eliminated any remaining doubt about his character and judgment. "Mr. Sullivan," Marshal Thompson said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted extortion, conspiracy to commit theft, obstruction of justice, and assault with a deadly weapon. You have the right to remain silent." As the marshal began reading, "Sullivan his rights," Kit felt a profound sense of justice mixed with relief. The man who had terrorized her with threats and attempted coercion was now facing the full consequences of his criminal behavior. Whitfield approached Morrison with obvious respect for the detective's professional competence. "Detective, I want to thank you for uncovering this corruption within my organization. Your investigation has been thorough and effective." Morrison nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir. However, there are still aspects of the cattle theft conspiracy that need investigation. Sullivan's arrest is just the beginning of unraveling what appears to be a larger criminal operation." Attorney General Harrison closed his notebook and addressed the group formally. "This case will require extensive investigation and prosecution. Detective Morrison, I want you to continue your work with full territorial support. Mr. Whitfield, we'll need your complete cooperation in documenting losses and identifying potential additional conspirators." Kit realized that while her immediate crisis had been resolved, the larger investigation would continue with ramifications throughout the territory. Her role in exposing Sullivan's corruption would make her a key witness in federal prosecutions that could reshape law enforcement approaches to frontier crime. Whitfield turned to Kit with an expression that mixed business calculation with human sympathy. "Miss Brennan, your situation presents some complicated legal and practical issues. However, your work performance has been exemplary, and your courage in facing these threats has been admirable." Kit held her breath, knowing that Whitfield's next words would determine whether she had a future on Copper Creek Ranch or would need to flee once again. "I'm prepared to offer you continued employment under your real identity," Whitfield said. "Formally, there will need to be some adjustments to accommodate the fact that you're a woman, but your skills and dedication have earned you a place here if you want it." The offer was more than Kit had dared hope for, not just forgiveness for her deception, but acceptance and continued opportunity. She felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that her gamble had somehow led to security and belonging. "Pete." Donovan grinned widely. "About time someone around here showed some sense. Charlie Catherine has been one of the best hands this ranch ever had, regardless of what name she uses." Morrison approached Kit with a smile that showed genuine pleasure at the positive resolution. "Congratulations, Catherine. Your courage in standing up to Sullivan's threats helped expose serious criminal activity. The territory owes you a debt of gratitude." As the group prepared to return to the ranch house with Sullivan in custody, Kit reflected on how completely her world had changed in the space of a few hours. Her carefully guarded secret was now public knowledge, but instead of destruction, the revelation had brought protection, respect, and unprecedented opportunity. The Montana landscape stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful as always, but now it felt like home rather than refuge. Catherine Brennan had finally found a place where she could be herself without fear or deception, where her skills and character mattered more than the circumstances that had brought her there. The turning point had come not through her own desperate actions but through the courage of others who chose justice over expedience, truth over corruption, and protection over exploitation. Her survival had depended on allies she hadn't known. She possessed and support she'd never dared request. As they rode toward the ranch house, Kit knew that challenges still lay ahead, but she faced them now with confidence born of tested courage and proven worth. The woman who had once fled Ohio in terror had become someone who could stand firm against threats and help others find their own courage in the face of injustice. She worked on a ranch disguised as a man until One Cowboy said, "I know who." You are. # Part 7. Resolution and lasting impact. 6 months after Jake Sullivan's arrest, Catherine Brennan stood in the doorway of her new cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The modest but comfortable dwelling that Marcus Whitfield had constructed for her represented more than just improved living quarters. It symbolized her transformation from a desperate fugitive living under false identity to a respected member of the ranch community with a secure future. The cabin included 2 rooms, a proper fireplace, and windows that filled the space with natural light. More importantly, it provided the privacy that allowed Catherine to live openly as herself for the first time since fleeing Ohio nearly 2 years earlier. No more binding her chest with strips of cloth, no more carefully modulated voice, no more constant fear of discovery. She could finally be Catherine Brennan without apology or explanation. Morrison had remained on the ranch to complete his investigation into the cattle theft conspiracy, which had proven even more extensive than anyone initially suspected. Sullivan's arrest had led to the discovery of an organized criminal network that stretched across 3 territories, involving corrupt ranch employees, dishonest cattle buyers, and railroad officials who facilitated the transportation of stolen livestock to eastern markets. The investigation had revealed that Sullivan had been working with a gang led by Thomas Garrett, a former cattle buyer who had established an elaborate system for stealing and reselling livestock throughout the West. Sullivan's position as foreman had given him access to information about herd movements, ranch security, and valuable animals that the gang could target with minimal risk of detection. Catherine's courage in standing up to Sullivan's threats had provided the breakthrough that allowed Morrison to unravel the entire operation. Her willingness to testify despite the personal costs had led to convictions that sent Sullivan and 6 co-conspirators to federal prison for terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. The legal proceedings had brought Catherine a level of recognition that initially made her uncomfortable, but gradually became a source of pride. Newspaper accounts of the case had portrayed her as a symbol of frontier determination and moral courage, inspiring other women facing difficult circumstances to seek help rather than suffer in silence. More practically, her testimony had established legal precedents that protected other individuals who had used false identities to escape dangerous situations. Attorney General Harrison had worked with territorial legislators to create new laws that distinguished between identity deception for criminal purposes and identity changes for personal safety. Pete Donovan had become Catherine's closest friend and most reliable supporter during her transition to living openly as a woman. The old cowboy's unshakable loyalty and practical wisdom had helped her navigate the complex social adjustments required by her new status on the ranch. "Morning, Catherine," Pete called out as he approached her cabin leading 2 saddled horses. "Beautiful day for checking on the spring calves." Catherine smiled as she gathered her hat and gear for the day's work. Her responsibilities had evolved significantly since Whitfield learned her true identity, but she still spent most of her time working with cattle and horses. The difference was that she now supervised other hands and participated in management decisions that shaped ranch operations. Whitfield had initially been uncertain about how to integrate a woman into his ranch hierarchy, but Catherine's demonstrated competence and the respect she commanded from other employees had resolved most practical concerns. She'd proven that gender mattered far less than skill, judgment, and leadership ability when it came to effective ranch management. "Pete," Catherine said as they mounted their horses, "have you heard anything more about the Henderson Ranch situation?" Pete nodded grimly. "Word is they lost another 50 head last week. Whoever's taken over Garrett's operation is getting bolder and more organized." Catherine's involvement in exposing the cattle theft conspiracy had led to her becoming an unofficial consultant to other ranches facing similar problems. Law enforcement agencies throughout the territory now sought her advice on recognizing and investigating livestock crimes, making her expertise valuable far beyond the boundaries of Copper Creek Ranch. The work was dangerous and demanding, but it provided Catherine with a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival. She was using her hard-won knowledge to protect other people from the kind of victimization she'd experienced, transforming her own suffering into a tool for helping others. Morrison approached on horseback as Catherine and Pete prepared to ride toward the spring pastures. The detective had become not just a professional colleague, but a close personal friend whose respect and support had been crucial to Catherine's successful transition. "Catherine, Pete," Morrison said in greeting, "mind if I join you today? I want to show you something I found during yesterday's investigation." Catherine studied Morrison's expression, recognizing the signs of excitement that indicated he'd discovered important information. "What kind of something?" Morrison reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather journal bound with string. "This belonged to Sullivan. I found it hidden in his old quarters when we were cleaning out his belongings. It contains detailed records of the theft operation, including names, dates, and locations that could help us identify remaining conspirators." The discovery represented a potential breakthrough in the ongoing investigation. While Sullivan and his immediate associates had been arrested and convicted, Morrison suspected that other members of the criminal network remained active throughout the territory. As they rode toward the pastures, Morrison shared details from Sullivan's journal that painted a picture of a criminal organization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The operation had included scouts who identified vulnerable ranches, drivers who moved stolen cattle along established routes, and corrupt officials who provided protection from law enforcement. "The most interesting entries," Morrison explained, "involve meetings with someone identified only as the banker. Based on the context, this person appears to have been financing the operation and laundering money through legitimate business transactions." Catherine felt excitement building as she realized they might be close to identifying the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. "Any clues about who the banker might be?" Morrison nodded. "Several entries mention meetings in Helena, which suggests someone with access to territorial banking and financial networks. I'm planning to investigate financial records to identify potential suspects." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of galloping horses approaching from the direction of the ranch house. Catherine recognized one of the newer hands, Jimmy Walsh, riding hard toward their group with obvious urgency. "Miss Brennan," Walsh called out as he reined in his horse, "Mr. Whitfield needs you back at the house immediately. There's been some kind of development with the federal investigation." Catherine felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. While the Sullivan case had been resolved, she knew that her involvement in the broader investigation made her a continuing target for criminals who might view her as a threat to their operations. Morrison's expression showed similar concern. "Did he say what kind of development?" Walsh shook his head. "Just that it was urgent and involved federal authorities. There are several men in suits at the ranch house, and they've been asking specifically for Miss Brennan." The ride back to the ranch house passed in tense silence as Catherine considered possibilities ranging from new criminal charges to threats against her safety. Her transformation from hidden fugitive to public figure had brought security and recognition, but it had also made her visible to people who might wish her harm. The scene at the ranch house was both reassuring and puzzling. Several well-dressed men stood on the front porch in conversation with Whitfield, but their demeanor suggested official business rather than crisis or threat. Catherine recognized one of them as Attorney General Harrison, whose presence indicated high-level territorial involvement. Whitfield approached Catherine with an expression that mixed excitement with amazement. "Catherine, these gentlemen have traveled from Washington with a proposition that I think you'll find very interesting." Attorney General Harrison stepped forward with a formal smile. "Miss Brennan, I'd like you to meet Deputy Marshal Frank Coleman from the U.S. Marshal Service. He has an offer that represents a significant opportunity for your future." Coleman was a tall, lean man in his 40s, with the kind of weathered competence that marked experienced law enforcement officers. His handshake was firm, and his gaze direct as he evaluated Catherine with obvious professional interest. "Miss Brennan," Coleman said formally, "your work in exposing the cattle theft conspiracy has impressed officials at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. We'd like to offer you a position as a special investigator with the U.S. Marshal Service." The offer was so unexpected that Catherine found herself momentarily speechless. She'd never imagined that her forced involvement in criminal investigation might lead to a career in law enforcement. "What kind of position?" Catherine managed to ask. Coleman's expression showed respect mixed with excitement. "You'd be assigned to investigate crimes affecting frontier communities, livestock theft, fraud, corruption involving local officials. Your unique background and demonstrated courage make you ideally suited for this work." Morrison stepped forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Catherine, this is an incredible opportunity. The Marshal's Service is creating specialized positions for investigators who understand frontier conditions and can work effectively in remote communities." Catherine realized that accepting Coleman's offer would mean leaving the security and familiarity of Copper Creek Ranch for a career that would involve constant travel and regular danger. It was both terrifying and exhilarating to consider. "I'd be working alone?" Catherine asked. Coleman shook his head. "You'd be partnered with Detective Morrison, who's also being offered a position with the Marshal Service. The partnership you've developed during this investigation has proven highly effective." The revelation that Morrison would be her partner changed everything about the proposition. Working with someone she trusted and respected would make the dangerous and demanding career much more manageable. Whitfield approached with obvious reluctance to lose a valued employee but clear recognition of the opportunity Catherine was being offered. "Catherine, this represents a chance to make a difference throughout the territory, not just on one ranch. While I hate to lose you, I think you should seriously consider their offer." Pete Donovan had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. "Catherine, you'd be the first woman marshal in territorial history. That's something worth considering." The historical significance of the offer wasn't lost on Catherine. Accepting the position would break barriers that might make it easier for other women to pursue careers in law enforcement and public service. Attorney General Harrison added additional context that made the offer even more compelling. "Miss Brennan, your success in this case has influenced federal policy regarding women in law enforcement. Your appointment would be part of a broader initiative to diversify and strengthen frontier justice." Catherine looked around at the faces of people who had become her friends and supporters, Morrison with his professional respect and personal affection, Pete with his unshakable loyalty, Whitfield with his practical recognition of her abilities, and the federal officials with their confidence in her potential. "I accept," Catherine said simply. "But I want to maintain connections to Copper Creek Ranch and continue helping Mr. Whitfield when my duties allow." Whitfield smiled broadly. "Catherine, you'll always have a home here. This ranch will serve as your base of operations whenever you need it." Coleman reached into his jacket and withdrew an official document bearing federal seals and signatures. "Miss Brennan, please raise your right hand. By the authority vested in me by the United States government, I hereby swear you in as Special Deputy Marshal Catherine Brennan." As Catherine took the oath that made her a federal law enforcement officer, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate fugitive to respected public servant. The woman who had fled Ohio in terror was now being entrusted with protecting others from the kind of victimization she'd experienced. 3 months later, Catherine stood on the main street of Silver Creek, a mining town plagued by organized crime and corruption, preparing to investigate reports of systematic theft and intimidation. Morrison worked beside her, reviewing information they'd gathered about local officials who might be involved in criminal activities. Their partnership had proven even more effective than federal authorities had hoped. Catherine's ability to connect with ordinary people combined with Morrison's detective skills to create an investigative team capable of solving complex cases that had defeated other law enforcement efforts. The work was challenging and often dangerous, but it provided Catherine with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that went far beyond personal survival. She was helping to establish justice and order in communities throughout the territory, using her own experience of victimization to protect others from similar harm. More importantly, her success was opening doors for other women who wanted to contribute to law enforcement and public safety. Her appointment had inspired territorial legislators to pass laws expanding opportunities for women in government service, creating pathways that hadn't existed before. "Ready for another adventure, partner?" Morrison asked as they prepared to enter the Silver Creek Sheriff's Office to begin their investigation. Catherine checked her badge and adjusted her gun belt, feeling the weight of responsibility and opportunity that came with her federal authority. "Always ready, Luke. Let's do some justice." As they walked toward what would undoubtedly be another complex and dangerous investigation, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by the simple act of pulling a desperate child from a well. That moment of compassion had led to discoveries about her own courage, connections with people who shared her values, and opportunities to serve others in ways she'd never imagined possible. The Montana Territory stretched vast and beautiful around them, full of challenges and possibilities that would test their skills and courage in ways they couldn't predict. But Catherine faced that uncertain future with confidence born of tested courage and proven worth, knowing that she was no longer running from her past, but actively creating a future that honored the values that had sustained her through the darkest times. The woman who had once hidden her identity in desperate fear was now proud to carry her real name into whatever adventures and challenges lay ahead. Catherine Brennan, U.S. Deputy Marshal, was ready to write the next chapter of her story with courage, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. 5 years had passed since Catherine Brennan first rode into the Copper Creek Ranch as Charlie, carrying nothing but desperation and her brother's borrowed identity. Now in the spring of 1890, she stood before the Montana Territorial Legislature as Deputy Marshal Catherine Brennan, delivering testimony that would reshape law enforcement policy throughout the American West. The legislative chamber buzzed with anticipation as Catherine approached the podium. Her reputation had grown far beyond the boundaries of cattle country. She was now recognized throughout the territory as the woman who had broken barriers, exposed corruption, and proven that courage knew no gender. Newspaper correspondents from as far away as San Francisco and New York had traveled to Helena to witness her historic testimony. "Honorable legislators," Catherine began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of facing danger and overcoming impossible odds. "I stand before you today not as an exception to what women can achieve, but as evidence of what becomes possible when we stop limiting human potential based on outdated assumptions." In the gallery, Morrison sat beside Pete Donovan, both men beaming with pride at their friend's transformation from desperate fugitive to respected public servant. Marcus Whitfield occupied a seat in the front row, his presence demonstrating the support of Montana's business community for Catherine's revolutionary work. Catherine's testimony detailed the successes of the federal law enforcement initiative that had begun with her appointment. Working with Morrison and other deputies, she had helped solve dozens of cases involving organized crime, corruption, and violence that had plagued frontier communities for decades. Their methods, which emphasized building trust with ordinary citizens and understanding local conditions, had proven far more effective than traditional approaches. "The old model of law enforcement," Catherine continued, "relied on intimidation and force to maintain order. We've discovered that understanding, compassion, and genuine commitment to justice create lasting solutions that benefit entire communities." Words carried special weight, because they came from someone who had experienced both sides of the law, as a victim fleeing injustice and as an officer working to establish it. Catherine's unique perspective had become invaluable in developing policies that protect vulnerable people while maintaining public safety. Following her testimony, Catherine walked through the streets of Helena toward the hotel where she would spend the night before returning to her current assignment. The capital city had grown dramatically since her first arrival in Montana, with new buildings and businesses reflecting the territory's rapid development toward statehood. As she walked, Catherine reflected on the letter she'd received that morning. From Ohio, Thomas Hartwell, the man whose threats had originally forced her to flee, had been arrested for fraud and intimidation involving other women in their former community. Her escape had apparently inspired other victims to come forward, leading to his downfall and prosecution. The news had brought Catherine a sense of cosmic justice mixed with sadness for the suffering that had been necessary to achieve it. Her transformation from victim to protector had required immense personal cost, but it had also created ripple effects that continued to help others long after her original ordeal had ended. That evening, Catherine dined with territorial officials who were planning Montana's transition to statehood. Her insights about frontier conditions and law enforcement challenges would influence the new state's constitution and legal framework. The woman who had once hidden her identity was now helping to shape the political future of an entire state. "Miss Brennan," said Judge Patricia Reeves, one of the few other women in territorial government, "your work has opened doors that many of us thought would remain closed for decades. What advice would you give to young women who want to follow your example?" Catherine considered the question carefully, thinking about the desperate young woman she'd been, and the countless others who faced similar circumstances throughout the country. "I'd tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. Every woman who stands up for herself or others makes it easier for the next woman to do the same." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics ranging from women's suffrage to educational opportunities to economic development. Catherine found herself at the center of discussions that would influence policy for generations, her voice carrying weight that would have been unimaginable during her desperate flight from Ohio. The next morning brought news that would test everything Catherine had learned about courage and leadership. A telegram from Morrison, who was investigating crimes in the Dakota Territory, reported a situation involving organized violence against homesteading families. The criminals were using tactics similar to those that had once terrorized Catherine. Herself, economic pressure, social isolation, and threats designed to force vulnerable people into submission. "I need you here, partner," Morrison's message concluded. "These families need someone who understands what they're facing and has the courage to stand with them against it." Catherine packed her gear with the efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light and move quickly. Her work as a federal marshal required constant readiness to face new challenges in unfamiliar places, but she'd discovered that her years of survival had prepared her for almost anything. As her train departed Helena for the Dakota Territory, Catherine gazed out at the Montana landscape that had become her true home. The vast prairies and towering mountains that had once seemed threatening now represented possibility and freedom. She'd found her place in this harsh but beautiful world through determination, courage, and the support of people who valued character. Over convention. The train carried her toward another confrontation with injustice, another opportunity to use her hard-won knowledge to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Catherine no longer fled from danger, she rode toward it, armed with federal authority and sustained by the knowledge that her courage could make a real difference in the world. Her story had become legend throughout the territory, inspiring countless others to stand up against oppression and fight for justice. But Catherine knew that the real measure of her success wasn't in the recognition she'd received, it was in the lives that had been saved, the criminals who had been stopped, and the barriers that had been broken for future generations. The woman who had once disguised herself as a man to survive, had discovered something far more valuable than safety. She'd found purpose, meaning, and the knowledge that one person's courage could indeed change the world. Catherine Brennan, U.S. Deputy Marshal, rode toward whatever challenges awaited with the confidence of someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. Behind her, the Montana Territory continued its journey toward statehood, shaped in part by the courage of a desperate young woman who had refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon her. Ahead lay new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that justice and compassion could triumph over hatred and oppression. The train whistle echoed across the endless prairie as Catherine Brennan rode toward her destiny, carrying with her the hopes and dreams of everyone who believed that a better world was possible for those brave enough to fight for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.